Now that we know that having a lot of fat mass on the body can increase the risk of a whole slew of things, I think an important thing to know is what actually goes into determining our body weight. And in particular, when I talk about that, I mostly mean what goes into determining the extra fat mass that we carry on our body, because of course, things like our bones and our muscles and all our lean mass also goes into our body weight. But when it comes to our fat mass, there's two main factors that determine if we're storing fat mass or we're losing fat mass. And that is how much energy we take in versus how much energy we burn on a consistent basis. That's an important thing to mention. Like one day of taking a bit too much energy in, or one day of exercising a lot, neither of those are going to make much of a difference. Okay, it depends on how we regularly do things. That adds up. Okay, energy intake is determined by our carbohydrates, our lipids, and the proteins that we take into our body, our energy yielding nutrients that we learned about in the last unit. Okay, alcohol also provides energy to the body. And overall, we can look at how many calories, which are units of energy, that we take in per day to determine our energy intake. Okay, our energy expenditure is mostly determined by factors that we have little control over that go into determining our basal metabolism. So for instance, how many calories do we burn keeping our heart beating, or helping to send nerve signals, or to do the plethora of chemical reactions that need energy in the body. That basal metabolism is mostly determined by genetics, though we can also promote a little bit higher increase in basal metabolism by promoting higher levels of lean body mass by mostly building muscle. Okay. About 10% of the energy we burn every day goes into something called thermogenesis, in particular something called the thermic effect of food. So when we process foods in our body, there's some heat produced and we expend some energy to do so. Okay, at most that's about 15% of our energy expenditure, but it's usually around 10%. And then depending on the person, about 15 to 30% of the energy we burn every day comes from physical activity. Okay, so people that are more active, a greater proportion of their total energy expenditure comes from physical activity. Okay, so let's say someone were to take in 2,000 calories of energy and they were to burn in a day 2,000 calories of energy. Energy intake minus energy expenditure in this case is 0, which would mean you're neither gaining nor losing fat mass. That said, if there's a day where I'm consuming 2,500 calories and I'm still only burning 2,000 calories, that means I have a caloric surplus of 500 calories. Those extra calories are already fat, or they're going to be converted into fat, and they're going to be stored within our fat cells. On days where I consume fewer calories, and let's say I burn more, 2,000 minus 2,500, in those days, I'm going to have a caloric deficit. And in those days, I'm going to be taking fat out of my fat cells, losing fat mass in order to fuel those activities. Okay. One day of a caloric surplus, one day of a caloric deficit doesn't make much of a difference. But if I'm consistently consuming more calories than my body needs, I'm going to be gaining fat mass and gaining weight. And if I'm consistently consuming fewer calories than my body expends, then I'm going to be losing fat mass and losing weight. Okay. And it takes approximately, this isn't black and white. It's approximately 3,500 calories that goes into 1 pound of fat. So more or less, but like it's not an exact science, if you were to have a caloric deficit of 500 calories a day for a week, theoretically, that would lose to a loss in fat mass of about 1 pound. Okay, so something to keep in mind there. So this just kind of gives the same idea of that energy balance equation, energy in versus energy out. And these are some of the things that we take in versus, the main thing we have control over when it comes to energy expenditure is our physical activity. Okay, so a little bit more about energy expenditure. If you want to figure out approximately how many calories do you burn, you might want to look at your basal metabolic rate, and a rough estimate of that is to take your weight in pounds and times it by 10. Okay, so if you weigh 200 pounds, your approximate BMR is about 2,000 kilocalories. Okay, your basal metabolic rate, as I said earlier, is mostly determined by genetics, which probably doesn't surprise you when you know that some people, have a really hard time putting on extra fat on their body because their metabolism is so, let's say, active, whereas other people might gain fat mass a lot more quickly than others, and mostly determined by genetic factors. Okay, having more lean body mass is one of the main things we can do. We can build our muscle mass in order to promote higher basal metabolic rates. Okay, greater height and weight also increase BMR, and being a male, men can usually almost always have a higher BMR, and can therefore eat a few more calories without gaining fat. Okay, and like I said, thermic effect of food, also sometimes we call this thermogenesis, and physical activity also determine energy expenditure. Okay, so like we said, basal metabolic rate. So if I were to lie in bed all day, I'm still going to get hungry because my body is using energy to do the things it needs to do. Okay, that said, and this number, like, it depends on the source, but anywhere from 20 to 35 or more, kind of 15 to 35% of the energy we burn comes from physical activity. And like we said, thermic effect of food is about 5 to 10%. It can be a bit higher if you eat a really high protein diet, but at most it's about 15% of the total calories you burn. Okay, so on the other side of things, and quite honestly, more importantly, when it comes to energy balance, is this concept of energy intake. How much do we eat? Energy intake is determined by a lot of different factors, like our environment or how we were raised, or our psychology, whether we're happy or whether we're sad, etc. But we typically talk about how much we eat in terms of how active our appetite is. This is one of the main things that determines how much we eat. Okay, appetite is a catch-all term for our drive to consume. So hunger, the physiological need to eat, think like your grumbling stomach, is one of the things that influences appetite. Okay, and hunger is determined by a lot of internal signals that, if you take my 4th year course on obesity, you're going to learn all about. It's really fascinating, all the signaling that happens in your body to basically tell an area of your brain called your hypothalamus, time to eat, time not to eat, right? Do we put the accelerator on? Do we put the brake on? Okay, lots of internal signals that influence that. Appetite is influenced by hunger. Our drive to eat is influenced by hunger, but I think we all know that sometimes we also eat when we're not hungry too, right? We eat because we're bored. We eat because it's 11 p.m. We eat because other people are eating. We eat because, we smell something, right? Sometimes we eat, we don't even realize we're eating. Okay, so there's other things that affect that. And what's really important to mention here is that when they've done genetic studies of individuals with obesity, they've found that there are about 100 different areas in our genome that are compromised in individuals with obesity. And those 100-ish areas of the genome, of our DNA, the changes tend to be localized around genes that are involved in appetite regulation. So we believe one of the main issues that is promoting obesity is dysregulated appetite. Okay, so it's really important, if someone kind of struggles to not eat so much, that they realize that there are some internal factors that might be influencing that. And, we can only do the best that we can with, genetics. We can't change our genetics. Okay. Something else we look at when we talk about food intake is this concept of satiety, which is kind of a synonym to the word fullness. Okay, how full do we feel? And if we feel full, we're less likely to eat. Some people feel full all the time and never have an appetite. Okay, so satiety is kind of the opposite of appetite. And again, that feeling of fullness all the time is probably due to genetics and internal signaling. Okay, that said, if you are like me, and if you have a condition that I like to call the eat forevers, where I can eat forever if I want to, it's probably important to eat foods that promote fullness, this feeling of fullness. So when you eat volume-rich foods with a lot of different nutrients, nutrient-dense foods, fiber-rich foods. Oh, and I don't have here, this is really important, protein-rich foods as well. These tend to be more satiating. They tend to be more filling. Okay. Something else to think about when it comes to satiety is that when you're eating, it takes about 20 minutes for the brain to register that you've eaten something. So if you're eating really quickly and you're still hungry, it might be just that your brain hasn't caught up with your digestive tract. Okay, so eating slowly might be one of the ways to help to manage that. Okay. So now that we kind of have an overview of what determines our weight, I want to go a little bit further and talk about some other specific causes of obesity. Okay, so for instance, we know that physical activity levels are declining, and we are spending more and more time just kind of lying on our couches or sitting in front of our laptops, or like, this is a sedentary behavior I'm doing right now. Okay, so physical activity is going down, but honestly, the main driving force in why we are larger as a society is we are eating too much. Physical activity is a part of the equation, but the bigger part is food consumption. And one of the reasons we're eating so much is that we live in what we call an obesogenic environment, an environment where food is everywhere and it looks good, it looks tasty, and it's in bright colors, and they make it look sexy to eat, and they make it look delicious to eat. And it's hard to say no to these external stimuli that are constantly infiltrating our brain, right? So we have to be aware of that and how, this environment influences our decisions. I am very conditionable by my environment, and a lot of you guys might be as well. So be aware if it's your environment that's like promoting your desire to eat, and be a critical thinking there, but also try to control your internal, like close proximal environment, so you don't so you eat an amount that's reasonable for you. So speaking of the fact that so many of us eat a lot more than our body needs, if you just look at the caloric value of some of the foods that we find at fast food stores, it's fast food shops, it's no surprising we eat as much as we do. Right? If you were to go to McDonald's and you get a burger and fries, you might be surprised to know that the burger actually has fewer calories than the fries. And you add that with a drink, plus let's say a milkshake for dessert, that's your caloric intake for the day right there. Quick calories. Okay. If you go to Dairy Queen, you pick up a Blizzard, it's just incredible how calorically dense some foods at. Even something like a Timbit, you're like, oh, it's only 70 calories, but like, how many of us only eat one Timbit? Usually we eat a lot more of those. And again, I'm not trying to be judgmental about any of these things or make you feel bad about your food choices. I think it's more being aware of what we're consuming and how the food industry manipulates foods to make them super calorically dense and nutrient poor, and market them in a way that makes us want to eat a lot of them. Okay, it's no surprise that there is so much obesity in our society. Which brings us to one of the kind of foundational concepts any course, any unit that talks about obesity will cover, which is something called the Foresight Model. So this came out in 2017 from something called the Foresight Group in the United States, in the UK. And it was this group of like stakeholders in obesity that came together and were like, okay, let's map out all the different causes of obesity that have some sort of evidence base to them. And let's look at how these things link up. So each of these little boxes, box, each of these boxes is a evidence-based cause of obesity. This area right here, it's kind of hard to see. These are all the things that affect appetite in particular. And you'll notice that there's so much interrelationship between things, right? So for instance, and feedback. So for instance, stress might promote appetite, which promotes overeating, which promotes obesity, which promotes stress. There's a lot of feedback that kind of promote an interrelationship that promotes this system. So they grouped the causes of obesity into 7 different, what we call causal nodes. Okay, and these causal nodes are listed on this slide here. Okay, so food consumption, we're eating more calories than that our body needs. That's going to promote fat storage. But in that causal node, it'll talk about things like internal sensing, appetite regulation, and other things that can promote a higher drive to eat. Okay. One of the major things from that model is that kind of the most links are between food production and food consumption. And the main idea there is that the types of foods that are produced in our society are ones that promote higher levels of food consumption. So for instance, if you look at how foods have changed from the 50s until now, our portion sizes are so much bigger, our caloric values of food are so much bigger. I don't know if you know this or remember this, but 7 years ago, I kind of forget, sometime in 2013-ish, Tim Hortons changed all their sizes. Okay, so what was formerly a medium was 10 ounces, and now a medium, when you go order a medium, it used to get 10 ounces worth of, let's say, hot chocolate, and now when you go to order a medium, you get 14 ounces of hot chocolate. So a medium has increased by 40%, which means that you are consuming 40% more calories when you order a medium at Tim Hortons. This is like reframed how we view portion sizes. And these portion sizes and the amount of calorically dense food that are produced, of course, that's coming back into promoting higher levels of food consumption. Okay? Like I mentioned, physiology impacts both our desire to eat, our appetite. Genetics can impact our desire to eat. Physiology also involves like our basal metabolic rate. It also involves like something called our microbiota, the amount of other organisms in our body that can promote food intake and promote higher caloric intake as well. So we all have a different physiology that's going to impact our likelihood to store fat. Okay. Physical activity, individual physical activity. Your individual experience of physical activity is probably going to be influenced by your past history of physical activity and your own physical capacities as well, right? If you've had a bad history with physical activity and you like had some poor messages when you were a kid, or you never really liked it, or you never really found something that you enjoyed, that's going to impact your levels of physical activity. So does the environment in which you live. In British Columbia, where I think a lot of people who are watching this video live, we actually have like one of the best places in the world when it comes to environmental physical activity. The weather's good. There's lots of bike trails. There's lots of hiking trails. There is kind of every kind of sport. You can technically snowboard and play golf in the same day. You'd have to do quite a bit of driving, but you could technically do that, right? We have an environment that promotes physical activity. I grew up in Ontario, in a smaller town in Ontario, and we had less opportunities. You kind of drove everywhere, and there was less hiking trails, and it just wasn't like a physical activity environment, okay? Of course, individual psychology also determines how much we eat and how much we exercise as well. So for instance, if someone is currently dealing with depression, that might affect their ability to, to go to the gym or to exercise, or they might cope with that depression by changing their eating habits, either eating a lot or a little bit. Okay, but that's just one example. Okay. And then our social psychology typically refers to like the psychology of the people around us or of the like town we live in. So for instance, you go to the people in Alberta, for instance, are going to eat, people in Calgary are going to eat differently than people in the east coast of Canada, right? So on the east coast of Canada, let's say Nova Scotia, people eat, it's more of like a lobster and fish culture. Hopefully I'm not stereotyping here. And in Alberta, because of what there's around there, it's more of like a animal products, meat forward, and it's like celebrated, that kind of culture. Whereas in BC, I would say they're pretty health obsessed and it's very like green, organic, whole foods kind of vibes out here, and that kind of influences what we eat, what people around us are doing, what our friends and family are doing. So again, I kind of covered this before, but just to go over it again, the reason we spend so much time talking about obesity is obesity significantly increases the risk of a number of negative health factors, not just affecting physical well-being, but also potentially promoting mental health issues, and also can, and that's not on this slide, but can also affect our social well-being. For instance, individuals with obesity can face a lot of stigma too. That's why we talk so much about obesity, and again, not to make you feel bad or to make you feel obsessive, because we don't want to do that, but it's just to make you aware and to, like, you know, have a honest but compassionate and loving look at yourself and your behaviors and see how they are potentially contributing or taking away from your physical and mental well-being. Okay? So in the next unit, we're going to come back and talk about some strategies that might help you achieve and maintain a healthy weight. So I will see you then.